Racism exists in varying forms around the world, and it can be difficult to rank countries based on their levels of racism because it's a deeply complex issue tied to historical, social, and political factors. However, there are some countries where systemic racism, discrimination, and xenophobia are more prominent or have been well documented. Factors influencing the perception of racism include historical context, such as colonization, slavery, and apartheid, which have created long-lasting divisions in many countries. Immigration and xenophobia also play a role. Countries with high levels of immigration can sometimes experience increased racial tensions or discrimination toward minority groups. Additionally, media and political discourse shape public attitudes by how racism is addressed or ignored in a country's media and political debates. Social movements, like civil rights or anti-racist movements, can influence the visibility of racism in a society. Some countries where racism has been particularly prominent, either due to recent events, systemic issues, or long-standing historical reasons include: the United States has a historical legacy of slavery. The U.S. has a long history of racism, particularly against Black Americans, Native Americans, and other people of color. The Civil Rights Movement brought major changes in the 1960s, but racial disparities persist in areas like policing, education, employment, and healthcare. Recent racial tensions have been highlighted by high-profile incidents, such as police violence against Black individuals, which have sparked significant social movements like Black Lives Matter. Racism is also often highlighted in political discourse, especially related to immigration. South Africa has an apartheid legacy. Although apartheid officially ended in 1994, the country continues to deal with the long-lasting effects of institutionalized racial segregation. The majority Black population still faces significant economic and social disparities. Racial tensions are ongoing between racial groups, particularly between Black and white South Africans, as well as within the Black community itself, for example, between Zulu and Xhosa. Brazil struggles with colorism and racial inequality despite being a racially diverse country. Afro-Brazilians, for example, face significant discrimination in education, employment, and even in interactions with law enforcement. The legacy of slavery is still felt today, as Brazil was one of the last countries to abolish slavery in 1888, and the racial divisions that came with that history are still present. India. Racism in India can often be more related to caste and colorism, with prejudices against those with darker skin being quite prevalent. Discrimination against people from Northeast India, African immigrants, and Dalits, who are historically oppressed lower castes, is still pervasive. In addition to these issues, India also experiences significant tension between different religious and ethnic groups, such as Hindus and Muslims. Some political leaders, unfortunately, fuel this divisive rhetoric. Australia. The treatment of Indigenous Australians remains a major issue, with ongoing disparities in health, education, and incarceration rates highlighting the systemic discrimination they face. Indigenous Australians often encounter racism and marginalization in various aspects of life. Moreover, there have been rising concerns about racism towards immigrants, particularly those from non-European countries. Racist rhetoric in political discourse has also become a troubling trend. European countries. In France, despite its egalitarian ideals, the country has struggled with racism, especially against North African and Black communities. Issues like police violence, discrimination in housing, and employment are widespread. Meanwhile, countries like Italy, Spain, and Greece have faced growing concerns about racism, particularly against migrants from Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Far-right political movements, which often espouse anti-immigrant and racist views, have gained traction in several European nations. In China, the treatment of ethnic minorities has drawn significant international criticism. For instance, the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang have faced severe repression. Discrimination against Tibetans and other ethnic groups is also a serious concern. Additionally, there have been troubling incidents of racism toward African immigrants and people from Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, these issues have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Russia. Racism and xenophobia. Racial discrimination in Russia is often directed at people from former Soviet republics, particularly those from Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Africa. Racial violence is also a concern, and extremist groups targeting minorities have been active in certain regions. Japan. Discrimination against minorities. Japan has a relatively homogeneous society, and there are long-standing prejudices against people of Korean, Chinese, and other non-Japanese descent. The Ainu people, an indigenous group in Japan, also face discrimination and marginalization. Hungary and Poland. Rising nationalism. In countries like Hungary and Poland, nationalist and anti-immigrant sentiments have grown stronger, with increased hostility towards refugees, Roma communities, and people from non-European backgrounds. Addressing racism. While these countries may have higher visibility or systemic issues with racism, it is important to remember that racism is a global issue, and countries with fewer reports of racial discrimination may still have underlying issues that are less visible but still harmful. The fight against racism requires not only addressing overt discrimination, but also tackling the more subtle, systemic forms of inequality. International efforts, such as those led by the United Nations and various human rights organizations, are focused on combating racism and promoting greater equality, but much work remains to be done globally.